Well, welcome back, everybody. Great to be with you guys again. Look forward to diving in. So we'll just dive in right away with a little recap. Last week, we talked about slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, and we ended in the middle of Jim Crow. So we're going to pick up from there and start with the Great Migration. So what happens as time is getting further away from the Civil War, and now that Jim Crow is in full effect and it's still a very oppressive society, we start to see a migration of people north. African former slaves and descendants of slaves are moving in mass numbers. The first wave is about 1.5 million, I believe, and that's like 1910, 1915 up through 1940, and then 1940 to 1970, there's about 5 million ex-slaves and their families that are moving north. So these are just a couple photos that can that people that were heading north during this time. This is a graph of the first migration, and you can see with the darkest color, that's where the highest concentrations of African Americans were, former slaves, and the lighter green or bluish, that's the routes that they took. And then you can see the cities that they stopped in and kind of developed, major population centers. So you have Savannah, Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, Nashville, Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, DC, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond. So you start to see this mass move as they're trying to get out of the oppressive system in the South. This is the 1940 to 1970, and you can see now they also head west. There's jobs out west. There's government, military jobs. So you see people going out west as well as up north, and Chicago being a big hub. So this movement created new issues. Before this migration, like over 90% of African Americans lived in the South. And so by the time we get to 1970, it's about, I believe it was 50-50. But what's also interesting is the former slaves in the South, they were rural, they were farms, they were country. And so as they're moving north, as we'll see, they tried to do that. They stopped, but they met resistance. And so they end up getting to the big city centers where there was some strength in numbers. And so the cities didn't know what to do with them, so they would block off areas for them to live in very harsh conditions. They didn't have access to the normal living places. And so by 1970, where it was like 90% were farmers when they left, now 80% live in urban dwellings and are urban. So it's interesting that a lot of times we think of African Americans as being urban, but they started out as farmers, but they were kind of forced into urban areas because when they were out on their own, it was very dangerous. And so that leads us to the first topic today, is sundown towns. And these were towns that basically meant you could work there, but you couldn't live there. And if you did move there, most times your house would be burned down and they'd be gone in the middle of the night. So sundown towns are communities that for decades, formally or informally, kept out African Americans or other groups. At least 10,000 sundown towns as late as the 1960s. In the 1960s, there were still at least 10,000 sundown towns out there, not limited to the South, Glendale, California, Levittown, New York. It was more likely that they were in the North because this started to, as the migration happened, this was one of the resistance pieces that I was talking about, this theme of gains are made and then there's resistance. And so this is another kind of look at that as progress is being made, they face new resistance. Many still exist today. I read about one in Illinois 2000, and they said there was a whistle that blew every night, and everybody knew that was when it was time for the African Americans to leave town. So you still have that legacy still lingering around. I know I talked to a gentleman who grew up here, and he told me about Cookeville, and he remembered in Cookeville the sign. Sometimes it would have the N-word, and it said, "Don't find yourself in this town after dark." And so you see it all at Ferguson in St. Louis. That was another sundown town. Here are some signs. Don't let the sun set on you. Here, understand. Sometimes the N-word was accompanied with that. This says, "Black men, don't let the sundown catch you," and I can't read what that town is. The black mule was also a symbol of a sundown town, so if they saw it, they knew you couldn't stay there overnight. I've heard that there's one of these in Watertown, but I have not seen physical evidence of it, but that has been said. So there are some still remnants around the country. So along with the sundown towns as one response, another response was race riots. And when I say race riots, a lot of times people think today race riots, and it's people in the inner cities rising up against injustice, tearing things up. This is the opposite. These race riots were whites forming mobs, and usually there's a flashpoint. There's something that triggers it. Could be accusation, word goes around, and then the whites gather there. They come and they basically burn down the city and kill and harm many African Americans. Statistics vary on a lot of these. I'm going to go through just a few of the bigger ones, but the statistics are hard because a lot of times there were mass graves, and nobody knows where they are today. I know in some they are still looking, but basically this was the white middle class working man also who was jealous that African Americans were making gains, and then they would backlash against them and come and wipe out a part of town. So just to go through these, Atlanta race riot. This was a big one on the national scale. Atlanta was a well-known city, and this was a French newspaper, and so it made the cover of that, and it made the news all around the world. Springfield race riot was another one. This was Lincoln's hometown, so this was kind of a shocker. They were kind of known to not have this, but what happened here was there was job competition, and you'll see this a lot with these riots. There's something that sparks. A lot of times it had to do with jobs, whether it was blacks being brought in to break a strike, or whether there was just competition between the workers. You would see something kind of ignite this. And so this was the case there. There was tension in this city. There's 2 alleged crimes. The 2 black men are arrested and a mob forms. Well, they got the men out of town, but the people are so upset in general, they just go and start kind of in the black part of town, just killing and destroying buildings. And one African-American gentleman, a really respected man in the whole town, successful businessman, he was murdered that night. And so it just was the mob unleashing for no reason other than they had taken the 2 people out of town. So after this one, the NAACP was formed. After this, they realized if this is going to happen in Lincoln's town, we need to do something about it, and we need to get more organized and get more intentional. So that was what was important about that riot. Then East St. Louis was another one. This was another worker-based one. Tension at the workplace. You see this, the newspaper headline, 100 Negroes shot, burned, clubbed to death in East St. Louis race war. This is the photo of a part of the white mob pulling an African-American guy off the trolley. Chicago race riot. This is another one that is pretty stunning in the sense that this was started because a black kid was swimming in Lake Michigan, and he crossed an invisible line, which is known as the white section of the lake. And so the whites on that beach where he was swimming out there, they began to throw rocks at him, and they hit him and he drowns. And so the blacks are upset, call the police. The police come and they arrest the black people for creating a disturbance. And so now the emotions get really high. It's real tense. There's a back and forth. And so white mobs form, and they begin to go and destroy all parts of the city, the black parts, and really displace hundreds and hundreds of homes, just destroy them, burn them to the ground, and wreak havoc throughout the city. And it lasts for days. These are just some photos of it. Actually, I have video footage of some of the buildings burning. You can see this is, this part of the destruction. You can see this is a younger mob of kids kind of going and destroying stuff. The Elaine race riot is another one. This was sharecroppers getting together in Arkansas. They were being mistreated. They weren't getting fair prices, so they decided to get together and have a meeting, and they were strategizing. The word went out that the Negroes were getting together to attack white people. That was, I think, the headline in one of the papers. And so the call went out to the white mob, and so they go down. They're meeting in a church, I believe, and a gunfight ensues. And so more and more people come, and hundreds are killed. Again, this is another one. You can hear 100, you can hear 300, you can hear 30. It's unknown, but the town, the descendants will tell you that it was a large number of people, and that people are buried all over. Again, this is 1919. I always like to bring that up because, again, all my grandparents are alive. This is not that far away from me. Here's some pictures. This Elaine. This is them marching the farmers into town. People hanging. And these two, Chicago and Elaine, were the two largest riots of what they called the Red Summer of 1919. There were so many riots, they called it that, and a lot of that had to do with the soldiers, the African American soldiers coming back from World War I. They had now fought for their country, and so there was this sense of, we fought for our country, put our lives on the line. We're not going to take what we used to take. So there's a bunch of cases like that happened, that they begin to stand up and fight back. And then this causes the white fury to rise. So that was one of the main things that contributed to that. And just, again, as African Americans are progressing and moving forward, they're not wanting to take all the stuff that they've been taken in the past. And they are, even through all the oppression, they are growing and making gains. And that's also building resentment in a lot of the white people. Tulsa race riot, another really big one. This one was big because they had a part of the city was called Greenwood, and it was known as the Black Wall Street. And they were very successful. Many businesses successful. They were known to be a really wealthy section of the city that created a lot of resentment in a lot of the working whites. So there was this tension that was there. And again, what set this off, which is common, a young man says he stumbled in an elevator and bumped into a girl. She screamed. All of a sudden, rumors started going out that a black man had attacked a white woman. The mobs get whipped up. What happens here is, again, a lot of because this is a successful town, a lot of the African Americans had guns, and so at the first time there was shots going back and forth, and so the call went out to the region and called for people. So the white mob comes and basically burns the city, the majority of the city to the ground, kills hundreds. Again, they don't know. It could be lower, could be higher. They say there's mass graves. They're still working on that, but the bottom line is they do basically burn the majority of the black part of town down and run off hundreds and hundreds of people. Never again, they lose their businesses, they lose their property, and really severe destruction. Have some photos here. You can see the Ku Klux Klan is participating here down in the corner. They're getting ready to go in. You see a postcard on the top that says, "Running the Negro out of Tulsa, June 1st." And then you can see the destruction of the buildings there. These are slides of people who had died. You can see a man burned, see a child carrying another child. Just brutal. Then once again, they were in the 1920s. Rosewood was a similar one. Successful part of town. The rumor is a girl had a relationship with an African American man. She gets caught. She claims that he was raping her, and so word goes out. Mob forms. They burn the city to the ground. They burn the town to the ground. Only one building remains today, and it was the white merchant's house. And he actually hid a bunch of the black members of Rosewood in his home as they were fleeing to safety. But by and large, the town was destroyed completely and has never come back. So that's the last. I was going to read one more race riot about Columbia because it was local. This was in the 40s after World War II. And this was similar in the sense World War II young veteran had come back. His mom went to the Castornot, and she had a radio repaired. They charged her, I can't remember, it was 10 or 15 bucks for it, and it wasn't repaired, and they weren't going to do anything about it. The mom gets a little bit of an argument with the man who worked on it, so her son steps in, and an altercation happens between him and the man, and the young soldier puts him through a window. That spreads around town. White mob forms. They go down to the black part of town, start shooting in it, and the National Guard's called. And what's significant about this is that this actually led Thurgood Marshall. He was with the NAACP. He was an attorney, and so he did this case. And what he said was this was the case that really helped them develop the strategy for the civil rights movement, because the Columbia and the Tennessee, they were doing all these maneuvers and resisting, and so they were learning how to fight within the court system, and that's what's been happening really even before this for African Americans as they're fighting for their rights. They're beginning to learn and decide to go the legal route. And so they said this case was a big one in them in learning the strategy of how to fight, which led them to the civil rights movement. So it was a very significant case because it really helped them move forward in figuring out how to win the battle of civil rights. I have a video here now.
There's no denying that white people in the U.S. have had privileges throughout history that people of color simply haven't. Consider the very first law passed by Congress after ratifying the Constitution, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that free white persons and only free white persons could become full citizens of this country. Basically, our very first law as a constitutional republic gave white immigrants privileges that black people and immigrants of color and indigenous native North Americans weren't given, all of it based purely on skin color. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, This kind of systematic white privilege and race-based favoritism is built into the very foundations of the country.
In 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt put his signature on the Social Security Act.
Look at all the social programs that pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and helped create the middle class in this country. Programs like job insurance, which provided cash to people to give them a leg up as they looked for work.
To show how job insurance works, let's introduce Steve, a Louisiana worker who has just lost his job. He goes first to the nearest state employment office to register for a new job. Steve needn't hesitate about going in because this office was set up just to help people like him.
But while Steve in Louisiana could apply for job insurance, not everyone else could.
Of course, he cannot collect if he belongs to any of the groups of workers that the law does not insure. These are agricultural workers, domestic service in private homes.
Agricultural workers and domestic service workers didn't qualify for assistance, and it turns out this had everything to do with race. These two jobs were overwhelmingly held by black people, and over 80% of all blacks worked in those professions. So the only way FDR could get Southern Democrats to support the Social Security Act was if he agreed to exclude those workers from benefits. This was a conscious attempt by some in Congress to exclude as many blacks as possible, and the net effect of it was to give preferential treatment to whites.
Thousands of people get a big thrill out of looking at model houses, and a much bigger thrill when they buy one.
It was the same story with crucial housing assistance for the American middle class. Loans provided by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, allowed working class families for really the first time in American history to own their own homes.
Home ownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens.
But the way the bill was written, the American dream of home ownership wasn't within the reach of everyone. For the first 30 years of the program, about 98% of the recipients were white. People of color were almost completely barred. Then there was the GI Bill, which provided immense benefits to returning veterans, including low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business, cash payments for tuition, and living expenses. What the GI Bill didn't do is protect black veterans, who qualified for that assistance also from the kinds of legal discrimination rampant in pre-civil rights America. The result was that the vast majority of those who benefited from the GI Bill were white veterans. If a program like the GI Bill ended up disproportionately benefiting people of color, you know what we'd call that? We'd call it welfare. We'd call it a reward, a handout, a gravy train.
The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward, or a handout, or a gravy train.
But that's not the way it was described.
But rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war.
And I'm not trying to say programs like these are bad. There's no question. They've been instrumental in creating and expanding opportunities for millions of people. The point is that we're being dishonest if we fail to explicitly acknowledge how they almost exclusively benefited white people.
Who is covered by the Social Security Act? People like these.
It needs to be understood that for hundreds of years, government assistance programs pumped literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of wealth into the hands of white families before people of color even got to the starting gate. This is what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege, the structural advantages built into our very system that have helped white people, often without us knowing it, while making things more difficult for people of color.
We want to look now into kind of more invisible ways that, as we've seen the visible kind of reaction against any kind of gain for African Americans, it was also growing in other areas. And so just wanted to look at some ways that there was resistance happening at all different kind of levels. So one way is the FHA loan program. Real estate was the number one way that individuals build their wealth. and it helped build the suburbs. So there was these massive loans that were given. Basically what happened, there was a shortage of housing after the Depression. And so they needed to get more housing going. So the government funded this FHA loan program, and they offered loans to people. And it's really what, again, built the suburbs as middle-class white people began to grow their real estate and wealth in that. And so, again, that's the number one way that we build our wealth in America is through our real estate. We buy a house, we pay it off, we pass it on to our kids. Our kids get a little more of a start than we did. You can use it to go through college. It gives you a lot of advantages. And so, as was said in the video, 98% of that money went to white people. They estimate it's around $120 billion worth of new housing subsidization by the government between 1934 and 62, and less than 2% went to non-white families. So non-whites were locked out of home ownership just as most white Americans were finally getting into it. This was in an underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration. It said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. So basically, when they were trying to do a loan, if you were African American or you lived in an African community, they couldn't guarantee your loan, so therefore you couldn't get it. Here's one example in Detroit. FHA would not go ahead during World War II with this development unless the developer built a 6-foot-high wall, cement wall, separating his development from a nearby African American neighborhood to make sure that no African Americans could even walk into that neighborhood. So you're beginning to see right there as America is trying to figure a way to help the middle class move up and build wealth. African Americans are cut out of that. The GI Bill is another one that was talked about. 86% of the skilled professional and semi-skilled jobs went to white veterans, and 92% of the non-skilled and service positions went to black vets. So when they were steering people in this, they would steer the blacks away from the skilled professional jobs, and they would steer whites towards them. So once again, they missed out on the opportunity for higher paying jobs and things like that. Just one example, again, in the summer of 1947, 3,000 VA home loans were issued in Mississippi, and only 2 of those loans were granted to black veterans. So even though these guys were veterans and they qualified for it, they still at the local level were steered away from it and didn't get access to it. This is one quote that kind of summarizes the whole GI Bill, and basically it talks about how much money home loans, but the bottom line was that there was no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. So the gap that was already there was widened even further because, again, whites got the large majority of the benefits of what the GI Bill bought. And then that leads us to redlining. In getting home loans, redlining was a practice that you would, the banks would map out cities, and where black people lived, they would make, called redlining, they would circle it. And so when the banks went to make loans, if you were in the red section, you weren't eligible to get a loan. So African Americans were caught because if they lived there, they couldn't get a loan. But on the other side, if they went to the white areas where they would apply loans, they were not allowed to have loans. So on both sides, they were losing out. They were, and there was nothing that was, what's the right word, the capitalistic, as far as they were looking at property values going up and down. It wasn't that at all. They were looking at, this is where black people live. We're not going to give loans there. And same in the white areas. This white people live. We're not going to give loans to black people in there. So you have this practice going, and once again, it's just one more layer of that wealth. When we look at the disparity of wealth between whites and African Americans, you can largely look at this 30, 40-year period of history and really see how white America really exploded into the suburbs, built their wealth, and African Americans were cut out of it. So these are just other redlining city maps. That these are actual maps that they used when determining loans. Here's just a few signs. The other thing is they marketed white communities. And so you'll see this throughout, different signs. These are just different signs. This is an ad in Arkansas, Siloam Springs. It says, good place to live, good place to make a living. And then over here it says no malaria, no mosquitoes, no Negroes. So they're marketing, this is an all-white town. Here's two other flyers, one in Salt Lake City, only members of the Caucasian race. Los Angeles, Eagle Rock. It has an ad for the Eagle Rock neighborhood. It says the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. So you see this marketing white neighborhoods as the suburbs are growing. You're seeing more and more ads, and so when there was an all-white neighborhood, usually there was resistance. So this is a photo of a white neighborhood with the sign showing up, and them resisting the ability to integrate the neighborhoods. And so you see this over and over. Levittown was one of the first neighborhoods that was all white, and also one of the first mass-produced neighborhoods. And so there's one in New York, one in Philadelphia, and so they were marketed. They were known as an all-white neighborhood, and they were some of the first mass neighborhoods that really led to the neighborhood movement throughout the country. And so I have a video here from the 1950s, just hearing from some of the white residents when the first black family attempted to move in the late 50s. Just again, to feel the resistance, trying to again get that sense, I'm an African American, I'm living in this country, and I want to believe in the American dream, so I try to buy a house, and this is the response. So this is late 50s, and again, remember, this is people who are willing to go on camera and say this.
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here. I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
What course of action are you going to follow?
I'll do what I can to help to get them out legally and peacefully. And as far as accepting them socially, if that's what you mean, I could never do that.
You're aware that a Negro family has moved into Levittown?
Yes, I heard about it.
What was your reaction?
Dynamite. Dynamite. I do not like it. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I'm not thinking much. I don't want her associating with colored people, period.
Well, I'm very definitely against mixed marriages, and that's eventually what it's going to come to. If children are raised together, they're not going to think of anything of marrying together.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community. And that's the only place I intend to live. If I have to leave Levittown, I will do so.
Okay, so that moves us into the civil rights era. And I'm going to probably move through this a little quicker just because it's some of the most studied. But just to start out, going back to Thurgood Marshall, and they began to build their legal cases. And Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, that was the landmark case. And what I think is important to think about again on this happens in 1954, but it takes a long time to be enforced. It's one thing to pass a law, it's another thing to enforce it. So you still saw a lot of resistance, and it took years for different states and schools to begin to move towards that. one of the reaction, like this is another reaction, as they make gains. So they had to merge schools, the black schools with the white schools. And one of the consequences that happened was many of the white schools basically wouldn't hire the black teachers. And so you had really all white teaching staffs, and you had, you know, some blacks might get a job in the library or different things. But what that did, the impact of that was, up until that point, education was one of the ways that African Americans could get a job and make a living. It was a good field for them, and therefore the best and the brightest went there. After the Brown versus the board, when they couldn't get jobs, we lost many, many teachers. And to this day, there's still a great need for African American teachers. And so, I think that's just one of the consequences. And when you dig into it, it's shocking how strong the resistance was from the white establishment. You could pass a law that the schools had to go together, but they fought it, and anywhere they could make a gain or hurt African Americans, they would. And so one of the ways was the teachers, they wouldn't let African American teachers teach white kids, and there was a lot of resistance in a lot of different places. Another reaction to Brown versus Board education was many private schools popped up. If you look, especially in the South, a lot of academies and schools came about in the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of it had to do with desegregation. And they found ways in some places where the state funded those private schools. So again, when you get into it, you see and feel how much the resistance was. And so when you dig into that, and some schools didn't integrate. Again, I think the Ferguson area, I think it was in the 70s, 80s until they finally were forced to integrate their schools. So there was still this big resistance, even though gains were being made legally. You could still feel the resistance from a lot of the white people. Obviously, Emmett Till, Rosa Parks. Emmett Till was a young boy from Chicago who was killed in Mississippi, brutally murdered, and for allegedly whistling at a white woman. And that really helped Rosa Parks. She was already active and involved, but that really was one of the things that gave her the strength to really take on the Montgomery bus boycott. Segregation was one of the big tools they were fighting. So segregating restaurants, pools. Here in Nashville, we have a history of the sit-ins in the early 60s. You can see footage of that, of how they worked on integrating the restaurants. And pools is another one around the country. You see some cities, when they're forced to desegregate and integrate their pools, rather than do that, they will fill them in with concrete. So again, if you can think about that as an African American, this is a country I belong to, and yet they will fill in a public pool with concrete before they'll let me swim in that pool. So again, if you can see through their eyes of what is society telling me about me, if they will fill in a pool with concrete. And Nashville had a similar. Nashville didn't. They had a lot of pools. They didn't fill them in with concrete, or maybe they were somewhere. But what happened there is two men went to integrate it, and within 2 days, Nashville shut down all the pools and then emptied them of water, and they stayed closed for 3 years. And so that was their way of dealing with it. Other issues during the civil rights was voting rights, sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration. All those things were battlefronts that we've heard about. And what I like to kind of say on the timing, when you think about this, I was born in the 60s. So when I was born in the 60s, they were murdering people for registering people to vote, which was their constitutional right for 100 years. yet they still didn't have those rights. They were tax-paying citizens. They didn't have those rights to vote, and they were murdering people for registering them to vote. They were filling in pools with concrete, and they were not riding, but the parents were getting very upset, even saying, we don't want our kids going to school with those animals. And this was into the 70s. So if you think about it, this is now in my lifetime. This is not way back there. And so if you think that changing laws are going to change it, it's the system, they can't change hearts. So while the laws changed, the resistance was still there. It just had to go more and more underground. And so that's kind of what happened, is the resistance morphed and changes, and that's kind of what has always happened. So also, I want to talk about desegregation of the schools in Nashville, because the same day that Little Rock was desegregating, the Nashville schools were desegregating, but all the TV cameras went down to Little Rock because of the standoff there. So Nashville didn't really get covered that much, but there was resistance here as well. And so I just thought I'd go through a few photos just to show, Nashville's response to when schools were desegregated. So here's a person walking the kids to school. If you notice, the sign says God is the author of segregation, and there's a Bible verse there, I think in Genesis. But a lot of times the Bible was used to as a weapon to agree with segregation. Here's another school where they're out in front. They have a KKK sign. Now, this is a local pastor with his communists infiltrated our churches. He's got 2 Peter 2:1-2. Here's a photo of young boys throwing rocks and bottles at a black family driving through. Again, to me, when you look at this, you think about these kids are probably in their 70s now. So they've been in positions of power and influence and jobs and things like that. And to think that they felt good about doing that to a black family, the way that it was okay as the parents stood by and watched them throw rocks and bottles. Again, you just think about how that plays itself out when they grow up to be adults. This is a photo. There was a bombing. One of the schools was bombed. This is a picture of everybody outside of that. So I have just a video here, a short video of the civil rights movement, and it has some of the footage. When I talked about the footage that I saw that really changed my trajectory, some of the footage is in this short video.
Oh, distant God above, why do you make us blind with eyes that cannot see? We seek but do not find. And if you are so near, why are you standing by when peace has been long lost? Please hear your children cry. Mercy, Lord, have mercy.
Okay, so in that footage, you saw the man being attacked by the mob, being pushed down, getting back up, picking his hat up. That was L. Alex Wilson. He was a former Marine, fought in the war. He was a newspaper reporter covering the Little Rock Nine, and he got attacked by the mob. And part of the story that isn't told, like, he died 3 years later by something that was similar to Alzheimer's, and they felt like it had happened because of the beating that day. And you look at that. He had a daughter, a wife, You think about that daughter and how this is on film. Like, we can see who did it, who attacked him, and nothing was ever done. So when you think about that family, that wife and that daughter, and we talk about justice and the justice system and how, again, liberty and justice for all, you wonder how they think about that and how they could believe in the system of justice when they watched their dad be beaten and it's all recorded and nothing happened. So that was really the moment, again, where my eyes opened and I began to connect the dots with where we are today, with what took place in the past. So I thought I'd close on this MLK quote. MLK obviously is the greatest leader of the civil rights movement. He was the voice, he was the image, he was leading the way. And I took this quote because I just think how deeply it resonates for today. Stunning. I think he said this in like 1966, and he said it earlier too in similar ways, but the fact that he's saying this over 50 years ago, and I think we could lay it over and look at it today. So I'm going to read it to you guys, and I just think these words are so powerful. He says, "I think America must see that riots do not develop out of thin air. Certain conditions continue to exist in our society which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these reoccurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention." So I just think, again, this is 50 years ago, and things have changed and progress has been made, but it's fascinating that what he says is happening, that he says this will happen over and over until we deal with the injustices. So I thought that quote really sums up, it's as relevant today as it was back then. And so I just was going to close on a verse. We talked about justice and how central that is to the heart of God. And just this verse in Zechariah, I think, we should think and meditate on. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the immigrant or the poor." So I just encourage you guys this week, tonight, to think about those things. Ask God to show you, where are we allowing the widow to be oppressed, the fatherless to be oppressed, the immigrant to be oppressed, or the poor to be oppressed? Is that going on in our area? Where is that happening? Because God has put us on this earth to be the arms of justice. So I just encourage you guys to think about that and ask God to show you if there's areas in your life where you could be a part of being that justice to somebody.